All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a highly complex proposed legal framework that sits right at the intersection of space tech, ocean protection, and international law. We are going to explain everything in detail because we're looking at a critical blind spot in India's governance. You see, the rapid rise of commercial spaceflight means our lower orbit is more congested right now than at any point in human history. And that leaves India's skies and coastal waters incredibly vulnerable to a sudden, catastrophic impact. So we're exploring the ambitious piece of legislation designed to finally fix this, the Space Debris Liability and Compensation Act of 2025. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Here is our agenda. 1. The space debris threat. 2. India's current legal vacuum. 3. Case studies of falling debris. 4. Global models for space law. 5. The bold 2025 proposed act. And finally, 6. Challenges and global strategy. Okay, Section 1. The space debris threat. A crisis looming over India's waters. Let's quickly establish the staggering physical scale of the danger that is quite literally hovering right above our heads. Right now, there are over 27,000 tracked objects in orbit. That is a massive, constant risk of hazardous space junk plummeting back to Earth. And we aren't just talking about harmless little pieces of metal burning up like shooting stars. No, we are talking about massive rocket stages and dead satellites that can easily survive re-entry. When they crash, they can release highly toxic materials. Take hydrazine, for example. It's a super common rocket propellant, but it's highly corrosive and absolutely deadly to marine life, even in really small concentrations. And because the physics of orbital mechanics are so volatile, the atmospheric drag on these dying objects is incredibly difficult to calculate. It's often impossible to predict the exact crash site until just the final few hours of descent. So an uncontrolled re-entry over a populated or ecologically fragile area, over time, that's basically a statistical certainty.
And that brings us to what's specifically at stake for India, a 2.37 million square kilometer exclusive economic zone, along with a 7,500 kilometer coastline. To put that into perspective, this vast maritime zone isn't just open, empty water. It's the absolute lifeblood of the coastal economy. It's packed with highly lucrative commercial fisheries, major tourism hubs, and incredibly sensitive ecological zones. Heavy metal toxicity or a hydrazine leak could completely devastate the fragile coral reef systems of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It could permanently contaminate the waters of the Sundarbans. So this is not some abstract space problem happening thousands of miles away. It is a very real, very direct threat to India's domestic marine ecosystems.
Moving to Section 2, India's current legal vacuum. Outdated laws for modern problems. So you might be wondering, exactly how is India protecting this vital maritime territory from falling debris right now? Well, the short answer is they really aren't. India is legally unprepared for a modern, high-tech threat of this scale. The foundational 1962 Outer Space Act was written back during the Cold War. It was designed entirely to align with early treaties focused on, keeping weapons of mass destruction out of orbit and ensuring the peaceful exploration of space by nation-states. It was written decades before the privatized commercial space race flooded orbit with tens of thousands of satellites, and long before space trash became a recognizable marine pollution issue. So the gap between the original intent of that law and our modern reality has created a massive legal black hole. Let's actually break down what this vacuum means on a practical level, because India's current environmental and space policies just completely fail to mandate strict debris mitigation. First off, the 1986 Environment Act gives the government broad power to regulate standard pollutants like oil spills or factory runoff, sure, but it completely ignores orbital debris as a class of pollutant. Second, we have UN CLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, this international treaty actually grants India full authority to prevent marine pollution in its economic zone, but India simply hasn't written the domestic laws needed to operationalize that power for space objects. Third, the much-celebrated 2023 space policy remains dangerously ambiguous for private companies like Pixel and Skyroot Aerospace. It encourages them to launch, which is great, but completely fails to mandate that they build controlled re-entry systems or carry specific liability insurance. And finally, despite numerous close calls over the years, India has never invoked the 1972 Liability Convention to seek international compensation for falling debris. Section 3. Case studies of falling debris. When the sky literally falls. To ground this dense legal theory, let's look at a few historical incidents to see exactly what happens when these policies are actually put to the test. Back in 1978, the Soviet Union's Cosmos 954 satellite, which, by the way, was powered by an onboard nuclear reactor, crashed into the remote wilderness of northern Canada. It scattered highly radioactive debris across a massive area.
But because Canada had strong domestic frameworks in place, they successfully utilized that 1972 Liability Convention to hold the Soviet Union at fault, securing $3 million Canadian to help fund the toxic cleanup. Fast forward to today, and India's state-run space agency ISRO is actually setting a gold standard. In early 2025, ISRO successfully guided its POM-4 module into a highly controlled zero-debris re-entry over open water. But here's the catch. The problem isn't ISRO. It's that India has over 100 private space startups launching hardware, and without a mandate, they just don't have the funding or the legal obligation to replicate ISRO's costly maneuvers.
The real test of India's current system happened in 2021, when a massive 22-ton Chinese Long March 5B rocket core tumbled out of orbit and splashed down in the Indian Ocean, just 400 kilometers from India's maritime border. While this sparked intense geopolitical friction, India's lack of action was fundamentally rooted in legal paralysis. Because India lacked a domestic legal mechanism to formally categorize the event, assess the environmental degradation, and rapidly quantify the economic damages, it simply couldn't utilize the 1972 Liability Convention. It's pretty straightforward. Without domestic legal groundwork to calculate the exact cost of the pollution, the international treaty is virtually useless.
Section 4. Global Models for Space Law. How other nations protect their skies. So, if India is currently exposed, how is the rest of the world handling this? Let's break down 3 distinctly different approaches.
The United States relies heavily on rigorous licensing through the FCC. They strictly enforce a rule requiring companies to deorbit their satellites within 25 years of completing their mission. If an American company fails to design this capability into their hardware, the FCC simply denies them a license, completely cutting off their market access. France takes a slightly different route with their 2008 Space Operations Act. They heavily regulate the physical engineering of the satellite, demanding zero-debris designs, and, crucially, they require operators to purchase comprehensive liability insurance before launch, guaranteeing a payout if something goes wrong. Lastly, Australia's 2018 Space Act perfectly integrates orbital physics with maritime law. They actively monitor re-entries alongside their naval and environmental departments to ensure total compliance with their UN SLOS obligations to prevent marine pollution. To effectively secure its borders, India essentially needs a hybrid of all 3 of these models.
Section 5. The bold 2025 Proposed Act. Anatomy of the proposed cure. And this brings us to the ultimate solution proposed to plug India's legal gaps and synthesize those global models we just talked about.
The proposed 2025 Act is designed around a few incredibly robust pillars. First, it establishes the legal standard of absolute liability for any damage occurring in India's maritime zones. In legal terms, this means victims don't have to prove negligence. If a foreign state's rocket falls and damages an Indian fishery, that state is automatically held financially responsible. No debate. Second, the Act creates a dedicated space debris compensation tribunal. Modeled directly on India's highly effective National Green Tribunal, this specialized body would bypass backlogged civil courts to rapidly assess complex damages like heavy metal contamination. Third, it completely overhauls private sector rules, empowering India's space regulator INSPCE to legally demand comprehensive debris mitigation plans before issuing any launch licenses. And finally, it officially classifies space junk as a marine pollutant under domestic law, paving the way for swift, legally backed cleanup operations.
Of course, because this is a massive bureaucratic overhaul, the proposed strategy relies on a carefully phased 3-year rollout to avoid completely paralyzing the industry. By 2026, the tribunal would be established purely as a pilot program in key coastal states like Tamil Nadu, just to test the judicial waters. By 2027, InSpace would slowly roll out its strict new licensing and insurance guidelines for private firms. And by 2028, the plan mandates a dramatic upgrade to ISRO's NETRA system. NETRA is India's Network for Space Object Tracking and Analysis. Right now, it needs significant upgrades to track highly dangerous objects that are smaller than 10 centimeters, which is going to require deep partnerships with the private sector to manage the immense data processing loads.
But as you might guess, building this sophisticated tracking infrastructure requires significant capital. Upgrading ISRO's radar and optical telescope systems alone will require an estimated 500 crore rupees by 2028. That's roughly $60 million US. Plus, you have to factor in the annual operating costs for the new judicial tribunal, estimated at another 100 to 150 crore rupees. This forces a really difficult financial conversation. 500 crore is a substantial chunk of India's space budget, meaning the government has to balance funding for prestigious new lunar and orbital exploration missions against funding for defensive radar arrays and judicial tribunals. And that tension highlights a massive question that you should take away from this explainer today. How does a developing space economy pay for these vital environmental protections without suffocating innovation? India is aggressively aiming to capture 10% of the global commercial space economy by 2030. To do that, it has incubated over 100 space startups that rely on hyper-cheap, small satellite models.
Section 6. Challenges and Global Strategy. Balancing innovation, law, and diplomacy. Let's dissect the intense economic and diplomatic hurdles standing in the way of this ambitious law.
Think about this. A massive $1 to $2 million compliance cost per satellite to install onboard propulsion and controlled re-entry systems could literally bankrupt a small Indian space startup before it even gets off the ground. If regulators push too aggressively, those startups will simply take their business to foreign jurisdictions with cheaper, laxer standards. This is exactly why the framework advocates for a tiered compliance system, kind of like the French model. Instead of a flat rule, the requirements scale based on the satellite. Furthermore, the government would establish subsidized insurance pools, absorbing some of the risk for tiny, low-mass CubeSats so they don't have to pay the exact same crippling insurance premiums as a massive multi-ton communications satellite.
Taking a step back, this entire legal and economic struggle is a perfect illustration of a classic tragedy of the commons, steeped in severe geopolitical friction. The United States, Russia, and China are responsible for the vast majority of the 27,000 pieces of junk currently in orbit. Yet, developing nations with massive maritime coastlines, like India, are the ones who disproportionately catch the falling debris. The nations polluting the orbit are largely not the ones bearing the physical and ecological risk when that material finally falls. This makes space debris an urgent issue of global equity and environmental justice, not just a technical hazard.
So, to defend its interests, India must engage in aggressive international diplomacy. In 2025, India assumes the chairmanship of UNCOPUOS, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The strategy here is to leverage this leadership role to aggressively push for globally binding debris standards, basically forcing the major polluters to comply. At the same time, India needs to secure bilateral data sharing agreements. Because India has geographical blind spots, it relies on real-time tracking data from NASA and the European Space Agency to know exactly what is passing over the subcontinent. Finally, India can utilize the Quad Alliance, partnering with the US, Japan, and Australia to align regional maritime defense and space tracking policies across the Indo-Pacific.
All of this leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder. Will India take the bold step to enact this law by mid-2026? Or will its seas and skies remain dangerously unguarded? The threat of space debris isn't diminishing. With thousands of new commercial satellites launching every single year, it is multiplying exponentially. India has the exact blueprint it needs in the 2025 Act to not only protect its own environment and economy, but to set a definitive global standard for how developing nations can survive the modern space age. The clock is ticking, and orbit is only getting more crowded.